Midnight. Wrong floor. Wrong door. I knocked twice. Half asleep. Keycard useless in my hand. The door opened anyway. A stranger stood there in flannel pajamas, hair messy, eyes wide. "You're not room service," she said. I froze. Mortified. Mumbling an apology I barely remembered later. She laughed instead of slamming the door. 6 months later. That laugh would nearly cost me everything. My name is Dana Whitfield, 31. Senior Operations Director at my family's catering empire in Chicago. A company built on my grandfather's recipes and my mother's iron discipline. I had never once, in my entire adult life, let anyone see me want something I wasn't supposed to want. That night in Chicago I was exhausted, 3 time zones behind on sleep, closing a supplier contract that would decide whether Whitfield Hospitality survived another recession. I never expected a wrong room number to rearrange the order of my whole life. Her name was Josephine Reyes, though she told me to call her Jo before I even stepped fully into the hallway light. She wore an apron under her pajama top, flour still dusted on one wrist, like cooking was something she did even in dreams. "You knocked like the building was on fire," she teased, and I felt my face go warm for no reason I could name. I explained the mix-up, the front desk's error, my own bone-deep exhaustion, and she just leaned against the doorframe, unhurried. "Come in for a second," she said. "I made too much bread and nobody in Chicago wants carbs at midnight but me." I should have said no. I said yes instead. And something in my chest quietly rearranged itself. Her hotel room smelled like cinnamon and yeast, warm bread cooling on a towel by the window, chaos organized like a kitchen mid-service. She was a private chef, she explained. Flown in to consult for a restaurant launch, the kind of job that meant she lived out of suitcases. We talked until nearly 3 in the morning about nothing important: bad flights, stubborn ovens, cities that never felt like home. When I finally left for my own room, I realized I hadn't laughed that easily with anyone in over a year. The next morning I told myself it meant nothing. A strange midnight coincidence I would forget by the time my flight landed back home. I did not forget. I thought about her laugh through 2 board meetings and an entire client dinner I barely tasted. 3 days later, my assistant Mia slid a business card across my desk. "Chef consultant for the Riverside launch," she said. "Guess who?" My stomach dropped in a way that felt dangerously like hope, and I hated how much I wanted it to be her. It was her. Josephine Reyes, standing in our test kitchen in chef's whites, laughing with our line cooks like she'd always belonged there. "Small world," she said when she saw me, and there was something knowing in the curve of her smile that undid me completely. We were professional at first, necessarily, carefully professional. 2 women who understood exactly how much was at stake if anyone noticed otherwise. But professional conversations kept becoming personal ones, lingering 10 minutes longer than they needed to, over recipe tastings and inventory sheets. She started leaving extra pastries on my desk, unlabeled. And I started finding reasons to walk past her section of the kitchen daily. My mother, Linda Whitfield, ran our company with the same precision she ran our family, and she noticed everything. Eventually, without fail. "You've been smiling at your phone a lot lately," she said one Sunday dinner. Not quite a question, entirely an accusation. I told her it was work stress relief. She studied me a beat too long before letting the subject drop, unconvinced. Jo and I started meeting outside the kitchen, coffee that turned into dinner, dinner that turned into walks along the river at dusk. She told me about growing up in a restaurant family, about a father who measured love in Michelin stars and approval ratings. I told her about growing up expected to inherit a legacy I sometimes wasn't sure I even wanted for myself. We understood each other in a way that felt dangerous precisely because it felt so effortless, so unearned, so easy to fall into. One rainy Tuesday, stuck late finalizing menus, she reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. And neither of us moved away. I've wanted to do that since the hotel, she admitted quietly. And my heart forgot how to beat at a normal pace. I didn't answer with words. I answered by closing the distance between us. And the kitchen lights felt suddenly too bright. Too honest. She kissed like she cooked, patient, deliberate, like she already knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to take her time. Afterward, we sat on overturned crates in the walk-in cooler doorway, laughing at how absurd it was to fall for someone over spreadsheets. This is complicated, I said. And she nodded, already understanding what I meant without me having to explain the Whitfield name attached to it. I'm not asking you to choose anything tonight, she said. I'm just asking you not to run from this before it's even started. I promised her I wouldn't run. I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in years. For the next few weeks we existed in a careful bubble, stolen dinners, late-night texts, a relationship built in the margins of both our schedules. She started calling me during her prep hours just to hear my voice while she chopped vegetables, and I started rearranging meetings around her breaks. My best friend Mia was the first person I told, sworn to secrecy over lukewarm office coffee and shaking hands. About time, Mia said simply. You've been half a person your whole career. Dana. Let yourself have this. Jo introduced me to her world slowly, farmers market vendors who knew her by name, a tiny jazz bar she loved, her chaotic joyful energy. I introduced her to almost no one. And the imbalance sat uneasily between us even when neither of us said it aloud. You've never mentioned me to your family, she said one night. Not angry. Just tired. Just honest in a way that stung. It's not that simple, I said. And immediately hated how much that sentence sounded like every excuse I'd sworn never to make. She told me, gently, about her ex Camille, a woman she'd loved for 4 years who chose her parents' approval over their relationship. I understood why she left, Jo said. I just promised myself I wouldn't wait around for someone else to make that same choice. Her words landed like a warning I didn't know how to answer honestly. Not yet. Not with everything still so fragile. Our relationship deepened anyway. In defiance of my silence. In small rituals, Sunday morning coffee. Her humming while she cooked in my kitchen. She taught me her grandmother's tamale recipe, hands guiding mine. And I felt more myself in that kitchen than in any boardroom I'd ever run. I started imagining a version of my life with her in it permanently. And the thought terrified and steadied me in equal measure. My brother Trevor noticed the change in me first. Sharper-eyed than my mother. Hungrier for any leverage he could find. You've been disappearing on weekends, he said. Too casually. At a family barbecue. Anyone we should know about? I deflected. He let it go outwardly. But I saw the calculation behind his eyes. Filing the information away for later use. Trevor had spent years resenting that I, not he, was being groomed to eventually run Whitfield Hospitality despite being younger. Any weakness of mine was ammunition to him. A way to reshape our mother's opinion of who truly deserved the company's future. I didn't realize yet how dangerous that resentment would become. How far he was willing to go to use it. Meanwhile, the Riverside restaurant launch approached. And with it, a partnership announcement that would tie Whitfield Hospitality to Reyes Culinary Group for years. Reyes Culinary Group, my mother said at a strategy meeting, tapping the contract. Manuel Reyes built that from nothing. Brilliant. Ruthless man. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. Reyes, I repeated. Is that Joe's father? My mother said, not yet realizing what those 2 words meant to me. She's the head chef. Technically the face of this deal. The company I worked for and the woman I loved were suddenly financially, publicly, irreversibly entangled. And I hadn't seen it coming at all. That night I asked Jo why she'd never mentioned her father owned the company we were merging with. Because he doesn't know I'm gay, she said flatly. And if this deal fails because of us, he never will. Either. The stakes of our secret had just tripled overnight. And neither of us knew how to make that feel less frightening. We stop, I said, panicking. Until the deal closes. We're careful. No risks. Nothing that could tie back to either family. Joe's jaw tightened. So we go back to hiding. That's your solution. It's not hiding, I said, though even as I said it, I heard exactly how much it sounded like hiding. She didn't argue further that night. She just went quiet in a way that scared me more than any fight would have. For 3 weeks we operated like careful colleagues in public and cautious almost strangers in private, the joy slowly leaking out of everything between us. I told myself it was temporary, strategic, necessary, the same word my mother used for every sacrifice she'd ever demanded of our family. Joe started pulling back first, canceling dinners, citing exhaustion, and I recognized the exact pattern Camille had left behind in her. I'm not her, I told Joe one night. Desperate. I'm not going to disappear the second things get difficult. You already are disappearing, she said quietly. Just slower than she did. The accusation cut deep because some small, cowardly part of me knew it was true. My mother, meanwhile, began pressuring me toward a very different future. Dinner introductions to eligible men from partner families, thinly veiled as networking. Robert's father runs half the linen suppliers on the East Coast, she said. It wouldn't hurt to be friendly. I sat through those dinners hollow, thinking of Joe's laugh, of tamales and jazz bars, of everything I was too afraid to claim. Trevor watched all of this with quiet satisfaction, sensing an opening he intended eventually to use against me. One evening, working late, I found him going through files on the Riverside contract that weren't his to access. Just making sure our interests are protected, he said. Too smooth. Too rehearsed. And I felt a cold warning settle in my stomach. I didn't yet understand what he was building toward. Only that it involved me, Joe, and a deal worth millions of dollars. Joe and I finally had it out on the restaurant's opening night. Adrenaline and exhaustion stripping away all our careful restraint at once. I can't keep being your secret, she said backstage, voice shaking. I have spent my whole life being someone's secret. I'm trying to protect this deal. Protect my family. Protect you, I said. And she shook her head slowly, eyes wet. You're protecting everyone except us, she said. There's a difference. Dana. And I think you know it. I had no answer for her. Only silence. And silence, I was learning, could break a person just as thoroughly as words. She walked away from me that night into a room full of applause for a menu we had built together. And I let her go. I stood alone backstage, hearing my mother praise the launch's success on stage, feeling like I'd won everything and lost the one thing that mattered. 2 days later, Trevor made his move, cornering me in my office with a printed photograph of Joe and me from a farmer's market. Careless, he said, sliding it across my desk. You two weren't exactly hiding at the strawberry stand. What do you want? I asked, voice flat, though panic climbed my throat like fire. I want the company, he said simply. Step back from the presidency track quietly, or Mom finds out. And so does Manuel Reyes. The threat wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a photograph, and a timeline attached to it. You'd blow up a merger worth millions just to spite me, I said, disbelieving even as I said it aloud. I'd survive it, he said. Would the two of you? I asked him for time to think, hating myself for even entertaining the idea of choosing career over honesty. Again, that night I called Joe, needing to warn her, needing to hear her voice more than I needed anything else in the world. She didn't pick up. She didn't pick up the next day either. And I understood, painfully, that I might have already lost her. I drove to her apartment, uninvited, desperate, and found her packing a bag for an early consulting trip to Los Angeles. I need to tell you something, I said, And the words about Trevor, the photograph, the threat, spilled out messily, urgently. She sat down slowly on her bed, absorbing it. So your brother is threatening to out us both to force you out of the company. Yes, I said. And I don't know what to do that doesn't hurt someone I love. It was the first time I'd said the word love out loud to her. And it landed in the worst possible circumstances. She looked at me for a long moment. You love me, she repeated, quiet, almost disbelieving. I do, I said. I have for months. I was just too much of a coward to say it before I had to. She didn't say it back yet. She just asked me one question. What are you going to do about your brother? I don't know, I admitted. But I'm done letting other people decide who I'm allowed to be. She reached for my hand then, cautiously, like testing whether the ground beneath us could actually hold weight again. Don't make me a reason to lose your family, she said. Make sure whatever you decide, it's actually for yourself. I promised her I would think clearly, not just react out of fear. And for the first time in weeks, she believed me. I flew home that night with a plan forming, dangerous and clarifying, the kind of plan that meant no more hiding for anyone. The next morning I requested a private meeting with my mother, alone. Before Trevor could get to her first with his version of events. I need to tell you something before someone else does, I said, hands steady despite the terror behind my ribs. I'm in a relationship with Josephine Reyes, I said. And Trevor is threatening to use it against me to take my position. My mother was silent for a long moment, longer than I could stand, her face unreadable in the way it always was during negotiations. How long? She finally asked. And I couldn't tell if her voice held anger or something else entirely. 8 months, I said. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid of exactly this moment. She stood, walked to the window, back turned to me. And I braced myself for the worst response I could imagine. When I was 23, she said quietly, I loved a woman named Patricia for 2 years before my parents found out. I stared at her, stunned into complete silence, the revelation reshaping every assumption I'd ever made about my own mother. They sent me on an extended trip to Europe, she said. By the time I came back, Patricia had married someone else. I married your father a year later, she continued. I told myself it was love. Some days I even believed it. You never told me, I whispered, throat tight with a grief that wasn't even mine to carry. I told myself silence was protecting the family, she said. I've spent 30 years wondering if it just protected my own fear. She turned to face me finally, eyes wet in a way I had never once seen in my entire life. I won't let you make my mistake, she said. Trevor doesn't get to weaponize something I never had the courage to claim. Relief and grief collided in my chest at once. Too large to hold. Too complicated to name in a single moment. What about the company? I asked. What about the deal with Manuel Reyes? Let me handle your brother, she said, something steely returning to her voice. That? The least I know how to do. My mother called an emergency family meeting that same evening, cool and composed. The version of her that terrified our competitors. Trevor arrived expecting leverage. He left without any. Blindsided by a mother suddenly and completely unwilling to be manipulated. If you ever use my daughter's private life as a bargaining chip again, she told him, you will not have a job here to threaten with. Trevor tried to argue business risk, shareholder concerns, optics, every corporate justification he could reach for in the moment. The only risk to this company, my mother said, is a son who thinks cruelty is the same thing as strategy. He left the meeting humiliated, and for the first time, genuinely afraid of consequences he had never considered possible before. I felt something unclench in my chest that had been tight for months, replaced slowly by something dangerously close to hope. But there was still Manuel Reyes to consider. Still the merger. Still the very real possibility this news could unravel everything professionally. Joe called me that night, having heard secondhand about the family meeting through industry gossip that traveled faster than either of us wanted. Is it true? She asked. Careful. Hopeful. Afraid to hope too much. Your mother knows and she's not. She's not, I said. She actually said something today I never thought I'd hear from her in my entire life. I told her everything, Patricia. Europe. 30 years of silence. And Joe went quiet, absorbing the weight of it. That explains a lot, she said softly. About why she runs everything like she's terrified of losing control of it. I want to tell your father, I said suddenly. Before Trevor finds another way to do it for us.
Yo hesitated.
He's old-fashioned. Dana. He built his whole identity on legacy.
Tradition.
Keeping up appearances for investors. I know, I said. But I'm tired of other people's fear deciding what we're allowed to have. She was quiet for a long moment. Okay, she finally said. Together. We tell him together. This weekend. Manuel Reyes agreed to meet us at his restaurant after hours, unaware of what the conversation was actually going to be about. Joe held my hand under the table the entire time, her grip tightening every few minutes like an anchor against her own fear. Dad, she started, voice steadier than I expected. Dana and I have been together for 8 months. This isn't temporary. It's not a phase. Manuel set down his coffee cup slowly, his expression unreadable, the silence stretching long enough that I stopped breathing entirely. You waited 8 months to tell me, he said finally, because you thought I'd care more about a merger than about you. I was scared, Joe admitted. You've spent 30 years building an image. I didn't want to be the thing that cracked it. He looked at her for a long moment, something softening slowly behind his eyes despite decades of careful pride. Your mother would have told you not to be scared of me, he said quietly. She always said I bark louder than I bite. It was the first time Joe had mentioned her mother, and I realized suddenly how much unspoken grief lived quietly between them. She's been gone 6 years, Joe told me later. He never talks about her. I think loving me openly feels like losing control again. That night, Manuel didn't offer a grand declaration of acceptance. He simply said, the merger stands. We'll talk more later. Mia. It wasn't everything, but it was enough of a door left open that Joe cried quietly in my arms in the parking lot afterward. That's the most he's said about anything personal in years, she said. For him, that was practically a parade. We drove home that night lighter than we had been in months, 2 families' worth of silence finally starting to crack open. But acceptance from parents didn't erase every obstacle still standing between us, especially not the professional storm still gathering around the merger's public rollout. A local business journalist, tipped off by an anonymous source Trevor later admitted arranging, began asking questions about a personal relationship affecting the deal. This could tank the entire partnership before it launches, our PR director warned. Investors are nervous about optics they don't understand. My mother called another meeting, this time with legal, PR, and Manuel Reyes himself, all crowded around the same tense conference table. We're not hiding this, my mother said firmly, silencing the room before panic could take over the conversation entirely. My daughter's relationship is not a liability, she continued. It's a fact. We'll handle it with honesty, not damage control. Manuel, surprisingly, agreed, adding that Reyes Culinary Group had survived worse press than 2 women falling in love together. Our companies decided on something unprecedented, a joint public statement, framing the relationship not as scandal but simply as truth. Trevor, cornered by his own leaked source finally being traced back to him, resigned from the company before he could be formally fired. I never meant for it to go this far, he told me privately, and I believed him. Though it didn't undo the damage done. You almost cost 2 people everything to protect your own ego, I said. That's not something I can just forgive overnight. He left quietly. And though our relationship remained fractured, I felt no satisfaction in his fall, only a tired kind of sadness. The public statement went out on a Thursday morning. Simple. Unsentimental. Honest, 2 women. 2 families. 1 partnership built on more than business. I braced for backlash. Some came. A scattering of cancelled contracts. A few investors quietly withdrawing. Exactly the fear I'd carried for months. But something else came too, messages from strangers. From young employees at our own company, thanking us for making space they hadn't had. I didn't know I could tell my parents about my girlfriend until I saw your statement. One line Cook wrote to Joe. And she cried reading it. The launch of the Riverside restaurant, delayed by weeks of chaos, finally happened on a warm Friday evening in early autumn. My mother stood at the entrance greeting guests. Manuel beside her. An unlikely alliance forged out of honesty neither had expected to need. Joe ran the kitchen that night with the same fierce joy I'd fallen for in a hotel hallway 8 months earlier. I watched her from across the dining room, plating dishes with total focus, completely herself in a way I finally understood I could be too. Between courses, she stepped out of the kitchen, found me by the window, and kissed me in front of the entire restaurant without hesitation. A few guests clapped. A few looked away, uncomfortable. And I realized I no longer cared which reaction outnumbered the other. No more hiding, she said, resting her forehead against mine. Not from your family. Not from mine. Not from anyone in this room. No more hiding, I agreed, and meant it completely, the words settling into my chest like something finally allowed to rest. My mother approached us afterward, uncharacteristically emotional, holding both our hands for a moment longer than any business handshake required. Patricia would have loved this restaurant, she said quietly, and I understood it was the closest thing to a blessing she could offer. Manuel, standing nearby, raised a glass toward the 2 of us, gruff but sincere. To honesty. Took the both of you long enough. The room laughed. Warm and easy. And for the first time in almost a year, nothing between Joe and me felt fragile anymore. Trevor sent a short message that night. No apology. Just 3 words. Congratulations. I mean it. I chose to believe him. Mostly. Later. After the last guests left, Joe and I sat alone on the restaurant's back steps, sharing the first plate of food either of us had eaten all night. Remember the wrong hotel room, she said, laughing, leaning her head against my shoulder under the city lights. Best mistake I ever made, I said, and she laughed again. The same laugh that had undone me the very first night. We talked about the future then, quietly. Honestly, no more calculated silences, no more strategic omissions between us. I want a life that isn't hidden in anyone's margins, she said. Not yours. Not mine. Just ours. Out loud. Then let's build one, I said, and I meant every word. No hesitation. No fear left holding either of us back. 6 months later, my mother restructured the company's leadership, naming me co-president alongside a newly hired executive team member she trusted completely. Manuel Reyes attended our small engagement dinner that spring, standing where I once feared he'd never willingly stand at all. My mother wore Patricia's old bracelet that night. The first time in 30 years she'd worn it publicly, without explanation needed. Trevor didn't attend, but he sent flowers. And small gestures, I was learning, could sometimes be their own quiet apology. The restaurant Joe and I met over became, unexpectedly, one of the city's most celebrated openings, written up for both its food and its honesty. A year after that midnight knock on the wrong door, I stood in a courthouse hallway, waiting to marry the woman who answered it. I used to think love meant careful hiding, quiet sacrifice, silence dressed up as protection. Joe taught me it could simply mean showing up, fully myself, unafraid, every single day. Andy.